And so in this way, we can see that even Truman's action desegregating the military is predated by Eisenhower's actions at the Battle of the Bulge. But all of that lay in the future as World War II came to an end. What was obvious to everyone in 1945 is that there were two great forces of nature on the rise. One was a man, Dwight Eisenhower. He was going to be heard from. His nation was going to demand his leadership at some point in the future. The other was a movement, the Civil Rights Movement. Black troops had shown in battle what they could do. Now they wanted the same rights in society. And so these two forces come of age together. And by the time of the 1952 election, you see this convergence, this intersection of Eisenhower and civil rights. And that leads to our second question tonight. How did Eisenhower approach the issue of civil rights, particularly as president? What was he trying to achieve? What was his thought process like? What were the goals that he had in mind? I think there are basically four pieces of this puzzle. And I want to spend just a second or two on each one because I think it's very important to understanding why Eisenhower did what he did and why he didn't do some of the things that he didn't do. First of all, he approaches civil rights believing that there are limits to federal power. And here is the specific political dilemma that he faced. The dilemma was, how do you promote minority rights in a country governed by majority rule? And how do you do it when it's not at all clear that a majority wants major change on civil rights? And indeed, in the book, I show that the polling throughout the early 1950s showed a very divided country on issues of race. There may have been a slight majority in favor of civil rights, but the intensity of the opposition was largely in the South. It was virtually split down the middle. So Eisenhower faces the problem of how do you enact change when a majority of the people may not even want it. That's number one. Number two, he believes, as I mentioned earlier, that there are limits to the rhetorical presidency. And in many ways, this is a response to the fireside chats of the New Deal era. Eisenhower doesn't believe that speeches solve problems. He believes that battle plans and action solve problems. And so, in addition to that, Eisenhower feared that rhetoric actually can sometimes be counterproductive. He feared that a speech could potentially raise expectations for African Americans and, in his words, inflame passions of white people in the South. So when Martin Luther King, asked him to come south and convene a summit and give a speech on civil rights, he turns him down because this is precisely what Eisenhower hoped to avoid. He wanted to avoid public pronouncements and work behind the scenes. Third, Eisenhower fundamentally believes in a conservative approach. And this surprises a lot of people when I say this because a lot of the conservative establishment that we know today, National Review, for example, comes online in the 1950s largely in opposition to Eisenhower. But Eisenhower is a conservative in the sense of how he views the world. That the world is broken, that it can't be perfected, and that essentially the best you can hope for is to manage a problem and promote incremental, step-by-step change. Not sweeping revolution, incremental reform. This is a classic conservative position, and this is his position on civil rights. In fact, in later years as a retired president in Gettysburg, watching LBJ, he complains of the Great Society to a friend that, quote, the glib assurances, and those were his exact words, had raised expectations for minorities to an unsustainable level. This is, again, a very classic conservative approach that you ought to speak quietly and softly and work for incremental change behind the scenes. He believes you have to do more than change laws. You have to change hearts and minds. And no less a source than Martin Luther King recognized this. Listen to what King said after he met with Eisenhower in 1958 in the Oval Office. King pronounced Eisenhower sincere on the issue of race, but he feared that this is what he thought Eisenhower feared. These are his words, that, quote, the surgeon's knife was an instrument too radical to touch this best of all societies. Again, evolution versus revolution. Gradual change versus radical surgery. King agreed that Eisenhower had the same goals, but he feared that he favored a much slower, much more incremental pathway to achieving those goals. And King was right. Eisenhower did. Fourth, and this may be the most important point of all in understanding Eisenhower's presidential approach to civil rights. Like all great leaders, Eisenhower not only saw things for where they were today, he saw things for where they were headed tomorrow. Almost from the beginning of his presidency, and almost alone among politicians and observers of the time, Eisenhower had a sense, a foreshadowing, that a Little Rock-style crisis was going to erupt, and he wanted at all costs to avoid that. Listen to what he wrote in his diary on July 24th, 1953. He's been president 6 months. These are his words. "I believe that federal law imposed upon our states in such a way as to bring about a conflict of the police powers between the state and the nation would set back the cause of progress in race relations for a long, long time." Eisenhower from 1953 on is trying to avoid a battle. He is trying to avoid a confrontation with the South. He wants to work behind the scenes. He wants to have incremental progress, and he wants to have improvement and real achievement, but do so in a way that's not counterproductive. Do so in a way that doesn't trigger a backlash in the South. Do so, frankly, in a way that doesn't produce a Little Rock. So, what are some of the things he does policy-wise as president, consistent with these 4 strands of thought that he's dealing with? Well, he starts where he has authority. One of the first places he has authority is the military. He's commander-in-chief. Eisenhower finishes the job of the Truman Executive Order. The military had largely dragged its feet. And so by the time 1953 gets here, you still have a largely segregated military. Eisenhower weighs in, and by the time 1953 ends, the military is largely desegregated. He starts with the District of Columbia, another city that is directly under the authority of the president in 1953. He urges the city elders to desegregate the city. Washington, D.C. was one of the most segregated cities in the South in 1953. Eisenhower urges them to desegregate the city. They do. He even brings in Hollywood executives and urges them to desegregate privately owned theaters, and they do. He also, under the advice and counsel of his Attorney General, Herbert Brownell, begins appointing fair-minded Republican judges all throughout the South, and this becomes very important years later in the 1960s. Andrew Young wrote in his memoirs that in the 1960s, when he and Dr. King were court shopping, trying to find a court that would give them a favorable civil rights movement ruling, their rule was you avoid a Kennedy judge and you find an Eisenhower judge, because the Eisenhower judges would give you better rulings. And so Eisenhower lays the groundwork for those successes in the 60s with his judicial nominees in the 50s. And finally, he appoints a number of African Americans to important positions, including the first African American to a senior executive level on a presidential staff. That's Fred Morrow, who serves on his staff. And Eisenhower believes that this is progress. Eisenhower believes when he looks around the District of Columbia in 1954, it looks a lot different. It looks a lot better. When he looks at the military in 1954, it looks a lot different. It looks a lot better. The problem is Eisenhower's evolutionary approach gets tossed aside with the Brown ruling in 1954. Because the Brown ruling in 1954 is nothing if not a revolution. And it forces everybody, including the president, to pick up the pace and do more. The Brown ruling, as we all know, strikes down separate but equal. And then the second Brown ruling in 1955, commonly known as Brown II, encouraged school districts in the South to put together plans for desegregation. Eisenhower, responding to the court, responding to the mood of the country, begins to pick up the pace. He pushes for the first major civil rights legislation since Reconstruction, which is later signed in 1957. And of course, most dramatically, he enforces the Brown ruling in its first major test, which is Little Rock. And Little Rock is indeed a great case study of the Eisenhower leadership model. Eisenhower, throughout the crisis, tries to use every option short of sending in the military. Going back to what I said earlier, he feared a police powers conflict with the states. He thought it was a very bad thing to have to send federal troops into an American city to enforce the law. He was willing to do it, but he wanted it to be a last option. So what were some of the other options he explored? Well, he first of all met with Governor Faubus, which didn't go well at all because Faubus agreed essentially to Eisenhower's request only to return to Little Rock and to keep the Little Rock Nine out. He worked through local emissaries, including Congressman Brooks Hayes, a Democrat in Little Rock, who tried desperately to talk sense into the governor at Eisenhower's request. That didn't work either. He tried having the Justice Department weigh in. In fact, the Justice Department was very involved in the court rulings in Judge Davies' courts in Little Rock in the weeks leading up to the final confrontation. None of this works. And so Eisenhower very calmly surveys the situation in mid-September with state Arkansas National Guard troops blocking the entrance, essentially, of the Little Rock Nine into Central High in utter defiance of the federal court. It's the gravest constitutional crisis since the Civil War.